Hey guys, good to see y'all. Thanks for that introduction, Peter. How you guys doing? First of all, a lot of you guys know my story and where I've come from, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. But let's start with today's topic, right? Today's topic is dealing with loss, and more specifically, leaning on your faith when you're broken, and tactics to process your loss and your grief along the way. So to start with, let's talk about the scope of loss. All right. A 2019 WebMD survey was conducted and asked people in America, have you been impacted directly by a loss event in the last 24 to 36 months? And this is characterized as an event that has substantially impacted or changed your life. 71% said yes. So let's do the math on that a little bit. 300 million Americans, 71%, that's over 200 million of us have gone or acknowledged that they had experienced a loss event that was still impacting them within a 24 to 36 month period. And that was before COVID. So this is the real epidemic here is that we are struggling with loss and brokenness. But that kind of begs the question, right? What does loss and brokenness include? Well, the obvious example is the loss of a loved one, but it's not limited to that. There's divorce, financial catastrophe, the loss of a business. People are struggling with depression, mental illness, and other tragedies and struggles, major health struggles, people being diagnosed with significant illnesses. The list goes on and it's long. And I mean, frankly, it impacts us all. And I think another characterization which is important to share is that loss is not a kind of a one size fits all idea. It comes in a million different forms and they all hurt. But I'm here to tell you that you're not alone, and that there is hope that you can get through what you're doing, what you're going through, and find joy following your loss. And that's not to minimize it. The journey is tough, and life is undefeated in this context. I know in my case, I've been challenged with some particularly tough stuff, and my journey includes, as many of you know, raising a child with special needs. For those who are going through that or been through that, it has its own set of challenges. I received a call in a management meeting from a paramedic in an ambulance that had my wife Victoria en route to the Norwalk Hospital at high speed, saying, you need to get to the hospital. We think she's going to live, but we're not sure. Nothing prepares you for that sort of a phone call. And in this case, Victoria did live through her accident, but then I lived through the next 4 or 5 years of nursing her back through neurological pain and trauma that she'd suffered through that process. And that watching somebody that you love struggle in pain and then slip, as Victoria did, and succumb to that pain and slip into a depression and struggle with her own mental health is part of that journey. I was diagnosed with cancer in 2015. Again, when the doctor looks you in the eye and says, listen, I don't know how to candy coat this, but you have cancer, is a life-changing event. And then in 2016, Victoria, after going off of her medications in an attempt to lose weight, leading up to our son's graduation from high school, spiraled back into her depression and committed suicide in May of 2016. So my journey includes some of the most toughest loss experiences that you can imagine. But while I happen to be, all so familiar with this, and this happens to be my personal journey, is clearly not a path I would have chosen. It's what a friend of mine in New Canaan, who lost his son to an opioid overdose, when we were talking about what we were trying to do to impact the kingdom in view of our loss, and Paul called it a reluctant platform, right? And I really agree with that. It's interesting. You're thrust into certain circumstances, and what do you do with that? What does God have in mind for you? So that's part of the reason we're here. But I do want to make it clear that, this talk and this discussion is not about me personally, because pain and suffering is not unique to my journey, and it's not unique to yours. And as my heart breaks for those of us that, and those of you who are going through tough stuff, as I have, the Bible is obviously filled with examples, right? Job is the oldest book in the Bible, and we know what he went through. I mean, effectively, suffering is not new to the human condition. This goes back as far back as we go. And I found it interesting in Psalm 23, which can be such an inspiring, uplifting psalm, that the insight that is provided in the first opening in verse 2, as he exhorts us, as David, the psalm writer, says, he restoreth my soul. Verse 3 says, he leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And immediately following verse 4, and says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I mean, effectively, David is making it clear that the path of righteousness, walking the path of righteousness, includes specifically walking through the valley. So, I guess bottom line, life includes hardship and loss, and that's our journey. But I'd say, of the great theologian Sylvester Stallone's Rocky, and Rocky 4, when he says, it's not how many times we get hit, it's how many times we get back up. So where am I going, with this talk? Well, following Victoria's death in 2016, after I'd been divinely healed of cancer, in a story that I won't delve into right now, I was commissioned in that experience with God to testify to his grace no matter what the circumstances. So I started attending and then leading grief groups, which I have for the last 4 years. I've interviewed hundreds of people. Some of you are on this call, talking about your grief journeys and your walks and your experiences. I researched loss and read through, you can't imagine how much material, with grief counselors and pastors, psychologists. And as it was pointed out early, my wife is a PhD, board certified psych mental health nurse practitioner. So, this is something that is my life work here moving forward. And, just a little note on the whole bald skit, I met, when I moved down here, I met Malin, and we had a pool, or I had a pool rather, and I was always futzing with my hair, and she's a triathlete as well. So she's like, why don't you just shave your head and get it over with, and say you take more care of your hair than I do. So literally, I went into the bathroom one day and just tried to cut it, and she shaved my head herself. And then we agreed, I do need some facial hair, because that's not the best looks. So at any rate, this is, for me, it was about starting over, and as I moved down here to Franklin, turning the page and taking the next step. And through this journey, through this last 4 or 5 years, I've written a book based on this experience, and launched the nonprofit that we talked about at the beginning, which is specifically geared to providing community and resource for individuals and churches and small groups to navigate together the topic of loss. So, I mean, it's important to understand the dynamics behind grief, that journey and recovery. So let me talk a little bit about loss and the grief journey per se. Most of you are probably familiar with what's considered the standard for grief recovery modeling, which is the 5 stages of grief, right? I don't know if you all have heard of that, but Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969 wrote a book called On Death and Dying, and effectively she outlined a 5-stage linear progressive model that included 5 individual singular emotional checkboxes, for lack of a better word, which were denial, anger, depression, acceptance. So that effectively you go through these emotions. But there was a big problem for me as I was attending grief groups and eventually leading them, the 5-stage idea made no sense to me. It didn't resonate with me. I was certainly not in denial, maybe shock when I found my wife's body, but denial didn't make sense. And then as the emotions kind of moved and intertwined and came and went, it was like, well, hold on a minute. I started interviewing people saying, so how did you experience your lost journey? That's the purpose of the interviews. Not a single person that I'd met said that this is how it worked for me. Okay, even in the caveats that they provide, you can skip a step, jump a step back, and nobody said it didn't make sense. So I did a little research and I found out that it was never intended as a model for those of us that have survived a loss experience or are going through it. Kubler-Ross wrote this specifically for people who had received, and it was based on research done with people who had received a terminal illness diagnosis and had 3 to 6 months to live. So popular psychology has taken this idea that people who are going through their own terminal illness diagnosis were somehow, in the same boat as those of us who had survived the death of somebody that we loved or gone through some of the other traumatic losses. It didn't make sense. It just doesn't work. So this led me in this direction. So what are we going to do about this? How are we going to better understand this? How can we help people in a God-centered, Christ-centered way find themselves on the journey through a grief process that can lead to hope and happiness and ultimately joy? So effectively, this is a grief theory from an experiential perspective, which is obviously very different from a psychology science-based theory point of view. So what I'd like to do is just walk you through a couple of quick slides to explain that. There's only 5 of these slides. I just thought it'd be really interesting to talk about this a little bit. So response, rather than it being linear, is actually atomic in nature. So what does atomic mean? It's kind of conceptual. Think about the protons and neutrons and so forth, particles swirling around in an atom, right? There's numerous different and high-speed collisions that take place within the atom. In this case, metaphorically, you've got emotional responses, life tasks and responsibilities, relationships. When you've gone through a loss event, all of this stuff is swirling, and not a singular emotional response, but multiple simultaneous responses that are happening. And it happens throughout all 3 stages of the survive, alive, thrive paradigm that I'll explain here shortly. But the issue is that think about it in the context of at your earliest stage, when you've just experienced a loss event. Take 10 ping pong balls in your mind's eye, which represent different emotions: anger, sadness, sorrow, and then different things you've got to do. You've got to set the service, etc. And you take those 10 ping pong balls and you put them in a goldfish bowl. Well, when you shake that goldfish bowl in the earliest stage, they're going to collide and bang into each other constantly. Now, as you move and you get a little more emotional elbow room, those 10 ping pong balls still exist, but now your emotional elbow room is equivalent to that of, say, a pod parked out in your driveway, the storage pod. If you could somehow pick that up and shake it, those 10 ping pong balls are still banging around. They may bump into each other, but with much less frequency. And then as you get to the thrive stage, it's not that your loss, your emotions, and your brokenness is gone. The sadness over somebody that you've lost is somehow no longer part of your journey. These experiences are woven into the fabric of our life journey. They'll never go away. It's just that they're mitigated with a much more elbow room and blessings and support and perspective that this healing journey and that God can provide. So as you get to thrive, those 10 ping pong balls are still swirling around, but they're in a container as big as a hot air balloon. And if you could shake that, they very seldom bang into each other, but they will. So if that makes sense, let's take a look at what's important about understanding the 3 stages of grief or the process anyway. Well, if you've ever been to a mall and it's, you don't know where you're going. The big "you are here" sign, right? You want to start where you are in order to be able to get where you're going. So in going through this process, the idea is to provide a roadmap for your healing journey. And when you know where you're going, as opposed to just wandering around the mall, it reduces anxiety, provides you with community of others who are going through it in the similar way and time, provides you hope that there's a destination and you can get there and you can experience joy. So what does it look like? Well, Survive Alive Thrive is a methodology for understanding where you are. They're interconnected stages. They provide for unique and individual emotional responses because we're all unique. And yet it ties the similar and common experiences that we're going through together so that you know that you're not alone. Stage by stage, we analyze there are hallmarks that are different by stage. What you feel in the survive stage and how your response and how you're responding is different than how you respond to your loss event when you're progressing and further into the thrive stage. It makes sense. But the emotional responses and notable challenges are still present, but they're different in each stage. So we provide healthy steps in each individual stage. And importantly, if you're not going through loss, how to support others in a way that is encouraging and not damaging. So for an example, Survive Alive Thrive, hallmark examples, right? In Survive, you're dealing with atomic chaos, you're overwhelmed, you're forgetful. As you move through the process, and you find that now, and it's not that, okay, June 27th, it's time for me to progress. This is almost reflective diagnostic in the context that, you know what, I found myself laughing today. And I found myself laughing about something my wife and I had gone through. Maybe my life is starting to progress. How do we plot ourselves and understand what that looks like? Okay, so as you understand that a little bit, in addition to understanding how grief is kind of interrelated and atomic in nature, I was also surprised to learn a couple of other things. Number one is that we relate to each other and what we're going through more by emotional response than by the type of loss we've been through. So what does that mean? I've interviewed women who have gone through the loss of a child. Some of them run out the door and fall on the grass and cry. And some sit stoically, some sob, some are numb and in shock, right? Those that are experiencing their loss in a certain way are more likely to connect with somebody who's lost a sibling or a parent or a spouse who also ran out the door and fell on the grass, or who sat stoically. I mean, they relate more to, I understand how you're responding and how you're experiencing this, regardless of the specific type of loss that you've been through. And of course, it's even more powerful when you're experiencing the same emotional response after going through the same type of loss. But the most important discovery here is that sharing your life experience, your loss journey with others who are empathetic is actually healing in nature. And there was a book, Anatomy of the Soul. I think Kurt Thompson appeared at one of our national retreats years ago, but he referred to this work from Dan Siegel, who's a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, runs this thing called the Mindsight Institute. He said it's possible to measure neurobiologically, you can measure healing. And he found that the act of sharing your life story with somebody who cares actually is a healing event for the person sharing, not getting advice necessarily, but just sharing their loss experience leads to healing. And I thought that was fascinating. I mean, sharing your story with someone who cares will help you experience healing, and they will experience healing through the process of support as they discover potentially they're on the same journey. So those are some building blocks, but of course, the foundation of all of this is the critical nature of God and faith along the lost journey. So let's examine just a couple of different ideas. First of all, when you're broken and on your knees, God provides the comfort that we so desperately need. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:4, he records Jesus saying, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Effectively, he is saying, come to me, mourn, and ask for my comfort, and I promise you that I will have it. I mean, that is such an extraordinary, profound, and yet simple understanding that comfort is available in a way that surpasses all of our understanding through Christ, who promises it to us. He also provides companionship and assurance. Hebrews 13:15 says what? I will never leave you or forsake you. As Paul writes, of course, that's from Deuteronomy 31, 1 Chronicles, Genesis 28, Joshua, Isaiah. The history of God is promising us, his children, that he will never leave us or forsake us. And while it may feel like it while we're going through it, that we're alone, we're not. And all we have to do is reach out for him, and he will be there. And our faith and relationship and reliance on God through Christ also provides us perspective and context that no other worldview can provide. James starts it out in his very first piece, which is, consider it pure joy, brothers and sisters, when you face trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. So what a perspective to try to have that God brings to us. It's like, look, no matter what I'm going through, there's a way to look at this a little separately, a little differently, that there is, in fact, the next point is hope, right? That knowing that we have, no matter what we're going through, hope in Christ. Paul puts it in context in 2 Corinthians 4, where he says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. That's a pretty, interesting concept. I can assure you that when I found my wife, when I was dealing with cancer, when I've gone through some of the experiences, that I did not consider them light and momentary troubles. Okay. In fact, they were overwhelming experiences of brokenness that I thought, I didn't know if I could even possibly get to the next moment or the next day. And yet Paul tells us that in the context of what God and his eternal promises are, they are indeed, we serve and follow a God in this context who did something super hard and painful for us that, it effectively means that he's here with us, but we're working with a God that himself has been through pain and suffering, at least to the extent that we have, and maybe beyond our wildest imagination. So if we know that we have a God who's been with it, who has suffered, and who loves us and will never forsake us, and that he promises us that no matter what we're going through, that in the end, we will see that his glory and wonder far surpasses anything we could go through. I've actually applied that theory in an interesting way to, and I'll use the death of Victoria as an example. You're familiar with the song "I Can Only Imagine" from Mercy Me? And it talks about this moment where, and we can put ourselves in, I can put myself into this place, can't we? That the moment that we come into Christ's presence after we leave this earth, that we don't know if we can stand on our feet or fall to our knees, or we sing, well, we could be able to, it's just a wondrous emotional, concept, right? Think about the joy. Well, that happened for Victoria. So here I am on my worst day, which was arguably the greatest day of her eternal existence. The moment that I'm grieving her loss, feeling brokenness on my knees, she is being embraced and experiencing the wonder that we can only imagine. And many people I've talked to about that idea who are going through this stuff find that to be comforting and kind of a different perspective. I mean, ultimately, there is joy to be had no matter what we're going through. In fact, it transcends temporal happiness, right? So let's ask ourselves, what is joy, for example? Well, Rick Warren's wife, had a quote that I liked. It says, "Joy is the settled assurance that God is in control of all the details of my life, and that ultimately everything's going to be all right. And the determined choice to praise God in every situation, which transcends our life experience, is ultimately joy." Think about that. The settled assurance that God is in control no matter what happens in this temporal world, the stuff that we're dealing with. Effectively, if we believe that our value is driven by our social status or how much we make or the car we drive outside our home, we are lost, right? I mean, obviously, Paul addressed this in Philippians in his famous verse that is in the Knowing You song that I so dearly love. But whatever gain I had, I count as loss for the sake of Christ because of the surpassing worth of knowing him. I mean, ultimately, we are in a situation in this journey, in our life journey, no matter what life throws and puts on our path. And Lord knows that life has put some tough stuff in front of me, but that our perspective, the opportunity to know that anything, no matter how tough it is or how wonderful it might be, is nothing compared to what God offers us. So what's next then in your journey or in my journey? Well, number one, sharing works. So find someone you can trust and share your heart with. I'll plug a little bit. survivaliveThrive.org is a nonprofit initiative designed to provide virtual grief groups where my wife and I, as a husband-wife team, experientially and clinically are leading grief recovery. You can register and join it virtually. And we're also working with churches to launch programs and customize them so that they have their own opportunity to provide for their congregants, as well as track and keep in touch with folks who are going through tough stuff and continue to support them. Number two, after finding someone you can trust and share your heart with, both individually and from a community standpoint, share your heart with God. Right. One of my go-to verses has been Philippians 4, and it's a well-known verse in the 6, 7, 8 range. And ultimately, Paul says to not be anxious about anything, and in every circumstance, with thanksgiving, through prayer and petition, share the needs of your heart with God. And the peace of the Lord, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your heart and your mind through Christ Jesus. I mean, ultimately, in the middle of the night, when I struggle, when memories come back, particularly when I was going through the toughest stretch, at 3 a.m, my eyes open. It's for me time to pray. It's time to say, okay, Lord, you've promised that in every circumstance, what I'm feeling, that if I tell you what I'm going through, that you'll provide me with a peace that surpasses all understanding. And he has never failed me. It's the only way I've been able to get through this stuff, along with some of these other steps. Finally, know that you're not alone in this journey, no matter how tough that it sounds. In my book and on our survivaliveThrive.org website, we have many stories of people who have gone through stuff, a podcast program. You can hear informational insight about how to understand grief, how to navigate the grief journey, and to hear stories of joy-filled lives, people who have overcome tough stuff and share their life journey and tips and ideas on how they've gotten there. It's what we call the joy-filled life. So there's information and tactical navigation and inspiration. The idea is, trust God. If you've been through it, and you're going through it, you understand the desperate need for people to be able to connect with people that get it. And I use this as kind of an analogy. Folks that were back from World War II or Vietnam, the classic example of a child, of a grown adult child saying, my dad would never, ever talk about that. And one day he gets into a room with a bunch of veterans and they are just talking up a storm. And he sits by the side and says, man, Dad would never even talk. It was always, we're not talking about that. But in the room, they're laughing, they're talking, they're crying. It's because when you surround yourself with people that understand this journey, it brings you the comfort and assurance. And after running grief groups for the last 4 years and currently doing so, the power of being with others and helping others is immeasurable. So finally, let's say that you're somebody who's been through tough stuff and you are, actually living a joy-filled life. And yes, your loss is part of your journey, but today you have it in perspective. You've been able to mitigate the acute pain and bring the memories and the blessings and the joys that you shared with the person that you've lost, or the struggles that you've been through, with you, but with gratitude that God has walked you through this process. Jimmy Graham had a quote that I absolutely love, and he says, the sufferer becomes the comforter in the service of the Lord. So as Christ modeled for us, obviously suffering, and now what happens when we are going through our loss experience as Christians? Okay, well, we lean to him for comfort. And to model that, if you've been through it and are living a joy-filled life, and there's many brothers on here who are doing this, right? I'm looking at you, Chip. You're taking what you've been through for good and changing people's lives. It's my mission. This is what I'm committed to doing moving forward, right? But the idea being, if you can share, you may be reluctant, say, listen, I don't really want to share my story. I don't want to go back into it. But think back to what you were going through when you were at your darkest moment. If somebody could have been there that gave you some insight and perspective that helped you realize you were not alone, what a gift that would have been to you. And if it was, then remember back on the gift that you experienced. You can do that for others, whether you're still early in, whether you're progressing and you're re-engaging in the alive stage, whether you're thriving in your life, you can help others, and in the process, help yourself through the sharing process. So in closing, right, what I'd say is life is hard. It's painful. I get it. I understand it. And I'm sure many of you do as well. But we do have this comfort that Romans, in Paul, as he writes in 8:28, right? And again, a very well-known verse, but he says that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose, right? So think about that, right? How astounding is it to think that the stuff that you're going through or have been through, in my case, have led me to a place where God is using it for good. He can do that for you as well. And I promise you, if you're someone who's going through tough stuff right now, or if you know somebody that is, that you can get through this, that you are not alone, and that there is a way to find community. And that community is twofold. It's vertically with God, because God is always with you, but it's also horizontally within our own worldly community of believers, whether it's through New Canaan Society, whether it's through your own small energy group or church group, or whether it's also integrating and bringing a Survival Life Thrive community component into your life. You are not alone, and you will be able to find your way to hope, happiness, and ultimately joy. So lean on God in the process. I promise you, he will be there. If you have a story to tell that will encourage others, or you're looking to share a story, then please contact me at mark@survivallifethrive.org is my email. And I would love to talk with you about your story and including your story in a way to help and lift others through the survivaliveThrive.org community. And finally, you know, I have a deep love for the New Canaan Society. I first showed up in Jim's living room in 2010, the year that my mom had died. I was running the men's group at the Congregational Church in New Canaan, and he and I kind of became friends through that process. And, you know, ultimately, I would exhort all of you to know that, you know, this is a safe place. This is a good place. These are people that care. Trust them and share your heart, and your journey, your healing journey will begin. So, you know, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And God bless you guys.